Victoria wasn't the type to believe in ghost stories. As a crime scene photographer, she'd seen enough death to know most horror stories were just that, stories. When the call came to check out the abandoned church on Hollow Street, she didn't flinch. The locals had said it was just kids sneaking in to fool around. The fact that it was almost Halloween only fueled the town's superstitions. People like to say weird things happened around this time of year, but Victoria dismissed it. As she walked toward the old building, camera in hand, memories began to surface. She had sat in these pews as a child, her family faithfully attending services every Sunday, her hands folded in prayer. That was a lifetime ago. Victoria arrived just before dusk. The church loomed before her, its once grand exterior reduced to a decaying ruin. The wind picked up as she pushed the door open. Dust and debris everywhere as she stepped in. She turned on her flashlight and it flickered in the dark. Inside, the church was even worse than she had expected. Pews were overturned, and the floor was littered with shards of broken stained glass. As she approached the altar, something on the floor caught her eye. Strange symbols were written in what looked like dried blood. They were intricate, and at the center of the markings was a single name. She paused, staring at the name. It didn't ring a bell. Probably a prank, she thought. She shook off the unease and continued her exploration. As she walked away from the altar, the ground beneath her feet trembled, just slightly at first, but then the tremor grew stronger. She stumbled back as the altar split open with a loud crack. A cloud of dust filled the air, and Victoria coughed, raising her hand to her mouth. When the dust cleared, she saw it. An ancient book, bound in leather, nestled within the cracked stone. She knelt down to inspect the book. The cover was worn, and it had the same strange symbol she had seen on the floor. Without thinking, she reached for it. The moment her fingers brushed the leather, an icy chill shot through her body, paralyzing her for a moment. She pulled back, her breath catching in her throat. The temperature in the room had dropped. Something about the book felt wrong. Still, she opened it, the pages brittle and yellowed with age. Inside, the symbols were even more intricate, written in a language she didn't recognize. That's when the whispers began. At first, they were faint, barely audible, but they grew louder, filling the room. Victoria stood up quickly, her flashlight swinging through the church, but there was no one else there. The sound was coming from everywhere at once. Victoria's flashlight flickered again as she caught movement out of the corner of her eye. She froze, her breath quickening as she turned toward the far corner of the church. There, half hidden in the shadows, stood a figure that looked like a nun. It was tall, pale, its eyes hollow and wide, and its mouth sewn shut with thick black stitches. The figure didn't move, but its presence filled the room with a suffocating heaviness. The whispers grew louder, closing in on her from every direction. Victoria's pulse raced as panic gripped her. She turned and bolted toward the door, but when she grabbed the handle, it wouldn't move. She turned back toward the figure, and her heart dropped. It was closer now. Its hollow eyes stared directly at her, and its stitched mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. She stumbled back toward the altar. The flashlight flickered, casting wild shadows across the walls. As the whispers grew deafening, Victoria fumbled with her camera, her hands trembling. Before she could think, the camera slipped from her grasp and hit the stone floor with a sharp crack. Then, invisible hands wrapped around her throat. She gasped, clawing at her neck, but there was nothing there, just the crushing force squeezing the life from her. Her vision blurred as the pressure increased, and she struggled to breathe. Victoria's body jerked violently as an unseen force lifted her off her feet and slammed her into the ceiling. Pain exploded through her as her back and head hit the stone above. The next moment, she was hurled back down onto the cold floor. In her haze of pain and panic, Victoria remembered the ridiculous scenes from horror movies where characters slash their palms in desperation. It never made sense to her, but now, as her life slipped away, it seemed like the only option left. In a desperate act, Victoria grabbed a shard of broken stone and slashed her palm open. Blood dripped onto the symbols, and the church trembled violently. From the symbols, small black serpents began to emerge, their scales glistening as they moved toward her. They slithered toward her legs, coiling around her ankles and slowly tightening. Panic surged through her. Her blood mixed with the symbols on the floor, and the serpents seemed to grow more aggressive, their bodies cold and smooth against her skin. Her eyes caught the name VALAK etched into the altar, and in her panic, the word slipped from her lips. She whispered, her voice barely audible. Desperate, her mind raced, and she found herself mumbling any prayer she could remember from her childhood. The moment she said the name, the serpents froze, their cold grip loosening around her. Slowly, they retreated back into the floor, disappearing as though pulled back into the symbols from which they came. The figure flickered and distorted as it struggled, but it was too late. With a final silent scream, the figure was dragged toward the altar and vanished into the darkness beneath the stone. The doors creaked open behind her. Victoria staggered to her feet. She stumbled out of the church and collapsed onto the cold ground outside, gasping for air. Days later, in the safety of her apartment, Victoria sat at her desk, trying to convince herself that what had happened in the church was nothing more than a series of nightmares strung together by exhaustion. She'd gone through her camera's memory card dozens of times, hoping to prove to herself that it had all been in her head. But each attempt left her empty-handed. Most of the photos were too dark or too blurry to decipher. Her apartment was eerily quiet, with only the hum of her computer cutting through the stillness. She clicked to the last image. The screen flickered for a moment, and then she saw it. The figure, standing in the shadows, its sewn mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, its hollow eyes staring directly at her as if it had always been watching. Her hand hovered over the mouse, frozen. She leaned closer, heart pounding as something else caught her eye. In the corner of the image, barely visible, was the name scratched into the darkness. VALAK. The temperature in her apartment dropped sharply. A wave of nausea hit her as the air seemed to thicken, turning cold and oppressive. The shadows in the room flickered, shifting unnaturally as though they were alive. She quickly turned off her computer, but the screen flickered back on by itself, displaying the same image, now zoomed in on the figure's twisted grin. A soft, scratching sound came from behind her. Victoria's heart stopped. She slowly turned, her breath shallow, expecting to see nothing. But there, on her apartment wall, was the name. It was as if it was clawed by unseen hands. Her vision blurred as the whispers started again, louder than before, surrounding her from every direction. She stood up, backing away toward the door. The wall seemed to pulse with the sound of scratching, and her legs trembled. Suddenly, her phone lit up on the desk, a single text message appearing. It read, "You can't escape." The last thing Victoria witnessed was the room plunging into darkness, and in the shadows, the figure from the church appeared, grinning and ready to take her life.